Numerous agencies have been waging a tireless and expensive war against this dangerous plant for decades.
The war on drugs is a war on the people. It's a war to fight for the pharmaceutical industry so they could sell their psychotropic drugs. I mean, Jesus, how many people that I hear horror stories from their children whacked out on Vicodin? Oh, that's a beaut. Yeah, how about a little Oxycontin, to make you happy? Feel some pain, this will get rid of it. But don't get high, man. No weed, it's gonna kill you. You saw Reefer Madness.
Reefer Madness is a celebrated PSA film produced for the U.S. government. Known for its even-handed and unbiased approach to the subject of marijuana, which it claims is worse than heroin, it saved generations from the dangers of marijuana. Even a single puff of Mary Jane can make you dance like a fool, laugh uncontrollably, or violently murder your friends. How embarrassing! NORML is a non-profit organization whose aim is to legalize cannabis throughout the United States.
There are 800,000 people a year arrested in the United States on marijuana charges, 90% for possession only. So over a 40-year period now, that's roughly 27 million people have been arrested on marijuana charges. So it's created a huge universe of people who have been effectively screwed by the government. When we sued the DEA in the classic case NORML versus DEA, the judge ruled in 1988 in his final decision that marijuana, quote, is the safest therapeutic substance known to man. That's a pretty strong indictment against the rest of the drugs.
So the courts acknowledge that marijuana is the most therapeutic substance known to man. But since as early as the 1930s, marijuana has been the subject of countless heavy-handed and fallacious propaganda.
Long-term use of marijuana can lead to a psychological dependency. Soon, you'll be taking all sorts of measures to get your fix. People will start calling you names like pothead or Smoky McBongwater. Losing all motivation, it's likely that you will drop out of school, take a sudden liking to sitar music, and maybe even get felt up by a cop or two.
Marijuana has been propagandized by the United States government and its surrogates at the state level for at least 75 years. There are 1,200 Partnership for Drug-Free America ads, and 85 to 90% of those ads have been against marijuana. And the name alone, Drug-Free America, deserves nothing but pure laughter. Drug-free America. This is the most drug-addled society in human history. And the Drug-Free America Association was originally founded by the alcohol, tobacco, and pharmaceutical companies, which, last I checked, their business model is distributing drugs.
Personal feelings about marijuana aside, there is no denying the fact that criminalization of the substance bears little parity with other substances in the same area, such as alcohol or tobacco. But with all the millions being spent on preventing its use and prosecuting individuals who use it, who stands to gain?
There are entities out there that strongly lobby for the status quo to stay in place. Law enforcement, the very government agencies born of the prohibition, like the Partnership for Drug-Free America, the DARE program, the DEA, the Drug Czar's office, they will always oppose legalization. 3 would be the alcohol, tobacco, pharmaceutical companies that play both ends of the middle. They try to start things like the Partnership for Drug-Free America, but pretty clearly don't want to really have a drug-free America. The 4th entity are companies that are able to make money off of the prohibition, and that would be private prisons, drug testing companies. This is probably the most naked of our opposition, because if you get caught with marijuana, you can either choose the route of prosecution and potential conviction and then going to jail, or you go to rehab. Well, even the director of normal, if I got caught by police with a small amount of marijuana, if I'm given a choice between going to jail and going to rehab, I'm going to pick rehab. And so 80% of their clientele are effectively pushed in the door by the government. So this is an incestuous relationship that has been set up between the drug rehabilitation profiteers and the government that brings their clients right to their door. And we, the taxpayers, pay for the rehabilitation.
Now, in the language the addicts use among themselves, they never say to each other, let's smoke a marijuana cigarette. They say, let's turn on, or let's blast a joint.
As with drinking raw milk, smoking a marijuana cigarette carries with it obvious health risks. But whether you want to blast a J or buy an outdoor slaughtered chicken from your local farmer, powerful lobbying groups have colluded with regulatory agencies to limit your freedom of choice.
When the government violently kicks down your door and comes onto your property with guns drawn, trying to get you to stop engaged in a certain behavior that's harming nobody else, that is a social injustice. I personally think of cannabis as just a metaphor for freedom. I think of it almost purely at this point now as a discussion over personal freedom and how much can the government intervene in your life, and intervene violently with guns drawn.
Okay, we've talked a lot about food and medicine and, Lobo, but enough of that hippie talk. Everyone knows the world revolves around one thing and one thing only: milk. I mean, money. But similar to independent farmers, small firms in the financial sector also face heavy regulations which benefit the large players.
I act in the securities industry, and there's all sorts of rules and regulations that I have to abide by. The vast majority of it doesn't protect my customers, the individual investor, and that's not why I believe it's there. That's the excuse that the politicians give the voters, but the real reason is because there are very large banks and brokerage firms that don't like small firms like mine competing with them, and so they want to tie us up in red tape. See, they can afford to pay for the regulations. It's the small firms that can't. But they didn't do it to help the investor. They did it to help the big brokerage firms that wanted protection from competition. And so that's what happens. But of course, the revolving door is when these guys leave Washington, they get cushy jobs at the companies they used to regulate. And in fact, they go back and forth. They go from the industry to the government, back to the industry to the government. And what they're really doing is they're peddling their influence. They go to Washington to get clout, to get influence, to make friends, and then they sell the influence to the highest bidder when they leave.
Sadly, the finance industry may be the best illustration of the intertwining of government and big business. For example, the current Secretary of the Treasury, Jacob Lew, was reportedly given a $950,000 bonus by his former employer, Citigroup, just for taking a job at the Treasury.
If you want to see the proof of fascism, all you have to do is look at 4 simple words. Too big to fail. The merger of state and corporate powers. When America had a financial crisis in 2008, the whole game changed. The banks got in trouble. They bring out Henry Paulson, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, former CEO of the Goldman Sachs gang, and says we have to bail out the banks. They're too big to fail.
The subprime mortgage crisis of 2008 was the biggest economic crash since the Great Depression. In the midst of the crisis, the financial media demanded stricter regulations on the financial industry. Economist Peter Schiff, who predicted the crisis years in advance, believes that not only was Wall Street to blame, but more importantly, it was the regulators colluding with the financial industry who were responsible for the crisis.
Well, the regulators caused the crisis. It was the regulation that created the problem. I was talking about the coming housing crisis in 2002, 3, 4, 5, 6, and I was pointing out exactly how the government and the Fed were creating the problem. See, the people that now said we didn't have enough regulation, where were they back then? Why didn't they say we needed more regulation in 2004, 2005? The fact of the matter is, it was the regulations that were in place that caused the problem. The Federal Reserve, in order to stimulate the economy, brought interest rates down to 1%. And what that did is it enabled people to borrow money more cheaply to buy houses. In the meantime, too, the government was also guaranteeing the mortgages. And this was the real problem. The way the market regulates banks is that individuals want a safe place for their money. And so they will shop around for a safe place. Therefore, market pressures force the banks to do prudent things to attract deposits. But once the government comes in and says, your money is safe no matter what, now the customer doesn't value safety anymore because the government has guaranteed it. But the problem with the government regulation is it's ineffective and it ends up being politicized. Because if you remember, during the housing days, as lending standards kept being lowered and lowered and lowered, it was the government that was leading the charge to lower standards. Because the voters wanted to buy more houses, because housing was thought of as a way to get rich. And the only obstacle was the down payment, the credit score, and so it was the government that was pressuring banks, hey, forget about credit scores, lower those down payments. So the banks are risky, the mortgages are risky, nobody cares about anything because the government's trying to make everything good. The government's trying to say, don't worry about risk, because if you fail, we're there to catch you, we're there to prop you up. And then when it doesn't work, capitalism gets a bad name, as if any of this has anything to do with capitalism.
Skipping ahead to 2011, we find the story of MF Global, a commodities brokerage firm headed by former Senator turned Governor of New Jersey, John Corzine.
It wasn't a pleasant return to Capitol Hill for former Senator John Corzine. He was subpoenaed to tell lawmakers how the company he headed, MF Global, collapsed and what happened to $1.2 billion of customers' money.
I simply do not know where the money is or why the accounts have not been reconciled to date.
Don't you hate it when you can't find your keys, your phone, or $1 billion of other people's money? It's so frustrating. But as uncomfortable as Corzine may have been sitting there and pretending to feel bad, others felt a little more MF'd by the situation.
I got burned by the MF Global scandal. That's when John Corzine, the former governor, Democratic governor of New Jersey, and former senator of New Jersey, and former head of the Goldman Sachs gang. After he did a stint with those, he was the head of MF Global. Yeah, MF. Perfect. MF Global went into my segregated account and stole my money. 6 figures, and I work hard for my money. I wasn't speculating in the markets. He went in and stole my money.
While investigating how this money was stolen out of his account without the financial regulators intervening, Mr. Salente's investigations found the telltale squeak of the revolving door. The CFTC is the agency which regulates brokerage firms like MF Global. At the time of the MF robbery, the CFTC was headed by one Gary Gensler, a close colleague of Corzine's.
Gary's never once let his team forget what this is all about. The American people.
Do you know what the Commodities Future Trading Commission did to John Corzine? After robbing me and thousands of others? Nothing. Nothing. Gary Gensler was his lieutenant at Goldman Sachs. And he's the head of the Commodities Future Trading Commission? You want to, to say that the fox is watching the chicken coop is stupid. It's worse than that.
The MF Global collapse is an example of the alliance between regulators and big business in the financial industry. But a more troubling phenomenon, called a bail-in, was recently seen in Cyprus.
Even in my direst predictions in this Parliament over the years about the way the EU bosses were behaving, never did I think that they would, in a completely unprecedented manner, resort to stealing money from people's bank account.
Recently in Cyprus, the banks had been irresponsible, and it was the public, all of the depositors, that paid the price, and they called it a bail-in to make it sound different from a bailout.
What happened was many of the banks in Cyprus bought a lot of Greek government debt. And as you know, over the last few years, Greek government debt has all but collapsed. So that made the Cyprus banks all but insolvent. And they went, just like always, the big banks went with the government and said, hey, we're broke. Can you help us out and steal money for us? And that's what they did. They just said, take 50% of anyone over $100,000, take 50% of all their money, just take it.
Just the term bail-in is a lie. This is something that is a marketing tool to basically cover up a theft. A bailout, they whip up currency and they give it to the banks, and then the public eventually pays for that through a tax called inflation, because there's now more currency in existence. A bail-in, they skip the part of creating currency and they just take it from the depositors. But basically, the banks win at the public's expense either way.
But that was Cyprus, not the US. There's just no way the citizens of North America would allow something as underhanded as a bail-in.
Canada actually put in their 2013 budget a bail-in clause, the exact same thing. They said if the Canadian banks have problems, that they can just take it from Canadian citizens. The US has been talking about it as well. The governments allow these banks to do these kind of things.
Cyprus was the model to see if they could get away with it. They got away with it, and now it's proven successful, so it is a solution they can use in the future.
In hindsight, it seems obvious that the financial sector would be rife with corruption and backdealing. Finance, education, the prison system, the military-industrial complex. Almost every industry in which there is money to be made has been affected by the revolving door. Even relatively new agencies are subject to its spin. If you need proof, try to take some nail clippers onto a domestic flight.
When you go to the airport, the TSA agents, want to go out and they want to invade your privacy. They want to look through your bags. They want to do all of this stuff. And you don't have the option to say no. Once you get in line, you can't get out. Now, what is the point of the entire TSA system? It's security theater. It's to make people feel scared, not to make people feel safe. Because the more they can actually make people feel scared, the more they can actually take a little bit of their rights away all the time and constantly remind them that they need the government to make sure that their safety is well taken care of.
The body scanners that stop you from taking dangerous objects, like bottles of water, onto planes, were installed due to TSA regulations. As head of the Department of Homeland Security, Michael Chertoff required every airport in the country have those scanners installed. For our safety, of course.
This technology allows us to detect any item concealed on a person's body, including molded plastic hidden under clothing.
The scanners themselves are built and installed by a company called Rapiscan. Can you guess who worked as a consultant for Rapiscan after leaving Homeland Security?
Oh yeah, I remember. Let me see. Cherkoff. He was the head of the Homeland Security right after the underpants bomber. Right after that happened, Cherkoff, whatever his name is, he appeared on all the national media. We have to get them X-ray machines in there. Rapid scam, somebody's scam. That's the name of the company. Yeah, well, they X-ray you. They X-ray you. Oh, son of a gun. Wow. Cherkoff is a consultant for that company after he left Homeland Security.
Okay, let's get this straight. GMOs, safe. Raw milk, unsafe. Preparing poultry in the open air is unsanitary, but drugs that cause heart attacks are fine. Blasting a joint will make you want to kill. Getting X-rayed at the airport is vital to national security, and stealing from your customers is okay, provided you do it $1 billion at a time. With regulatory agencies so deeply entangled with big business, it's almost impossible to know whether the rules we live by are there for our safety or someone else's financial benefit. Whatever the reason, the end result is our lives are now so heavily manipulated by the desires of others that our choices are becoming more and more limited.
That's what government regulation is all about. It's all about limiting your choices. The government wants to make those choices for you. They want to take away your freedom to choose. The choices that you make, the types of food that you eat, right? All of this is determined for you by the government. And why can't we make choices, right? That's what freedom is about. The politicians think that, hey, it's important that we all vote. They can trust us to vote, but they can't trust us to make these basic decisions about whether we should buy a house or whether we should rent their house, or should we use this broker or that broker, or should I put on my seatbelt, or should I wear a helmet, or should I smoke cigarettes, or, all these choices need to be made by the government, but somehow we're smart enough to vote, but we're too dumb to do just about anything else.
This over-regulation has implications other than just limiting our choices. By giving government agencies the authority to regulate our lives, even in the name of protection, it has led to an expansion of government power at the expense of individual freedoms. What's the old saying? Give them an inch, and they'll take your money, life, and favorite dairy products? Something like that.
The more laws there are, the more rules and regulations there are, the more taxes there are, the less freedom you have. I mean, that's what freedom is. It's freedom from government. So when people are free, it means that they do what they want. They don't have to do what the government tells them.
Career bureaucrats are usually dedicated pro-regulatory people. They are fans of state paternalism, of government making individual choices. And the result of that is to really deprive individuals of sovereignty. It makes individuals mere functionaries of the state rather than people who can pursue their own self-interest and enjoy the benefits and blessings of liberty.
It really does come down to who owns me, who owns the individual. You can't have a system that denies choice, trying to protect us from the risk of bad choice, and preserve the freedom to make good choices. That's the problem. You can't have it both ways. Freedom requires risk.
Should I wear a seatbelt? Is this bank a safe place to keep my money? Do I need insurance? We're all so busy with our daily lives that making important decisions can become overwhelmingly daunting. A lot of people prefer the freedom from making choices, even if it means the choices being made for them aren't the best.
The idea that government should make our choices for us is one that a lot of people prefer, rather than to make their own choices. But once the point is reached, like in the former Soviet Union, when choices are made for you by the government to such an extent that it destroys the economy, that it destroys free agency, that it renders everyone a servant and the state a master, then at some point individuals come in large numbers to the conclusion that they're not getting what they were promised, that they are overtaxed, they're overregulated, that their choices are limited, that paternalism is disgusting, it's caused me heartache, and I'm going to reject it. I want my freedom.
Until that point is reached, most people will be content with their comfortable lives and the choices still available to them.
The hardworking people don't have time to watch or hear what's going on. They're working 24/7. They're trying to make ends meet. So, what does America watch? Hey, you know, Kim Kardashian's pregnant. She's going to have a kid real soon.
The media makes sure that we don't dwell very long on any really serious issue. We've all seen the phenomenon where there's something very serious that comes up involving the serious aspects of what's going on in the world, and it gets on the news for a very brief period of time. And all of a sudden now that's been switched off, and we're soon distracted with soapbox operas and Dancing with the Stars and all kinds of things that are entertaining, and I'm not saying anything against them, but it's not as serious as the lack of everybody's freedom through a new amendment to the Patriot Act, for example.
The media may try their best to give us a fair and balanced opinion of world events, but there are now other avenues available for those seeking unfiltered news.
The way that the net and the web were built involves a lot of decentralization. It moves power into the hands of the people sending and receiving messages, as opposed to the people in the middle that are handing them off. And that is a scary prospect for entrenched stakeholders.
Any alternative media, other than the corporate media that is so rigidly controlled, is a threat. The internet is certainly a threat because the internet gives almost anyone access to the world. So now, are we surprised when the political figures who don't like that are constantly worried about how can we stop this? Well, the formula has been tried and true. It always worked. Just tell the people that there's a threat out there that only the government can control. I mean, there's a threat of child pornography or crime or terrorism or cyber terrorism or something. We have to control the internet for your good, folks. Otherwise, you're going to have a big problem. That's why they're working around the clock to try and scare people into thinking that the internet must be controlled by our fine, trustworthy political figures. They want to be the ones that control the internet and tell the world what is proper and what is improper.
If you look at the history of communications media, people said with cable television we'll finally be free of centralization, and with the telegram we'll finally be free of centralization. And really the worst case scenario would be if we saw that history just repeat itself exactly. If we saw this amazing decentralized distribution method, the most effective one ever produced in the history of humanity, if we saw it captured by a handful of centralized stakeholders and them controlling and surveilling the communications that go through it.
Good things, unlike processed cheese, never last. In an attempt to regulate yet another slice of our lives, legislative bills are already in the works to try and control the internet. But rather than wait for pesky red tape like passing laws, the government has been proactive in trying to censor the internet, for our safety, of course. For example, with the help of their good buddies in big finance, they were almost able to shut down the controversial website WikiLeaks.
Think what you will about WikiLeaks. The point is that members of the government were able to just speak with payment processors and create this blockade and say, you cannot transfer money to this organization. And it's not much of a leap to say, wait, hold on. The government, or in some cases companies, can decide that nobody can do business with these people, or that nobody can see what these people are publishing. That's obviously a problem in our tradition of free speech.
WikiLeaks was able to survive thanks mostly to a very new concept: decentralized money. Unlike most currencies in the world, which are created and regulated by central banks, decentralized currency, such as Bitcoin, is created by the people, and as such is almost impossible to control.
Bitcoin's a decentralized peer-to-peer currency. It's actually an internet protocol, kind of like SMTP, that's how you send emails. Well, it's money over internet protocol. It's how we can send money over the internet. And we can use it to transfer value without having a middleman. That means we don't need a bank or a money transmitter between us, someone like Western Union. We can just send money like we send an email.
Bitcoin's, I'm incredibly excited about it because it's the first free market private money that's also a technological money. It's electronic currency. The great thing about it is it's not controlled by a central bank. It's not controlled by anyone. It's actually really the people's money. So it gives a lot of freedom.
Why do we have the supply of money and the cost of money, or interest rates, set by some bureaucrats 3,000 miles away in Washington, D.C.? How efficient is that for our economy? Because interest rates, they regulate production over time, and they regulate all the production within the economy. You know, whether we should save or whether we should build something. Bitcoin liberates that interest rate because it's a censorship-resistant currency, so we don't have to use their money system anymore.
Decentralized currencies like Bitcoin offer an alternative to the highly regulated and controlled national currencies of the world. But, as with the government's push to regulate the internet, attempts to regulate the purchase of Bitcoin have already been seen.
I recently tried to start up a Bitcoin ATM. I hired some lawyers in the US and they told me, you're under 5 different regulators in the US. You're under banking, finance, money, even telecommunications, because we're using the internet. And we looked into the total cost just to start a Bitcoin ATM, a very basic product, no less than $25 million, because we needed all kinds of insurance bonds as a money transmitter. This is how they keep competition out, because they don't want competition.
These attempts to control increasing amounts of our personal lives have some people very concerned. And with each successive law or regulation, the temptation to opt out entirely becomes more and more appealing.
There are some people that are abandoning ship. They see the ship is sinking. They don't know whether it's going to sink for sure or stay afloat somehow. They don't want to stay around to find out. They're just leaving while the getting's good. And I'm not going to tell somebody not to leave because I don't know for sure how bad it may or may not get.
Jeff Berwick is someone who has already decided to opt out. To this end, he formed an expat community in Chile, hoping to create a haven for freedom-loving people who can no longer tolerate the government encroachment in their personal affairs.
We started this community because we've really recognized that a lot of people around the world want to get out of these Western countries. Rising taxation, rising regulation, people are getting put in jail in the US all the time for nothing, victimless crimes. People who have done nothing except for maybe drink raw milk or have some plants in their pocket called marijuana. What we're trying to attract and what we've been attracting is more freedom-minded people. Everyone has their own personal story. Sometimes it's as simple as someone's been pulled over like 10 times in a month and been searched. I've seen people who have had their entire businesses taken away through regulation and fascism in the US. There was one doctor who came down recently. He had a practice in the US. He had a almost 100% cure cancer rate within 1 month. And he had about 30 SWAT team come in one day and everything taken by the government. And so many people are just had enough of being pushed around, stolen, beaten, put in cages for nothing, to have most of their money taken away, and even sometimes their entire livelihood taken away.
Not all of us can just pack up our lives and move to Chile. So what practical options are left? Identifying the root of the problem is a good place to start.
The issue is there's this merger of what would appear to be private enterprise and government. And the only way to break it is to restrict the power of the state. Once you give the state the power, the authority over our lives in all these areas, then there's no stopping it, because then the individuals who are in those fields of providing medical services, monetary services, banking services, power and gas and oil and all these services, they will gravitate to the government, buy off the politicians, make the mergers, pass the laws to their best interest, and the average, the gum-chewing public thinks, oh, well, isn't that nice? Well, we voted for these guys, so I guess it's in our best interest. They don't get it. If you take all the temptation, all the power away from political office, the only people who will go into it will be those who want to serve their country, because there's no way to steal anything anymore.
The only idea that I have as far as trying to make government smaller is that in the United States, we've got the Constitution, but every government could pass some sort of amendment to their Constitution or whatever that says that for every law, act, code, or regulation that these screwballs want to pass, that they've got to find 2 old laws, codes, acts, or regulations that they have to repeal. That's the only way that I can think of making government smaller. And the same thing goes for all of the agencies. If they want to open up some other agency or department, they've got to close too.
Individual freedom is what defines humanity. Although laws and regulations can make us feel safe from the threats we may face, all the safety in the world means nothing without the freedom to live as you choose.
Freedom is the most important and indispensable characteristic of mankind. We can be induced by promises from government to depart from our liberty, but there's nothing more profound for an individual than when they are denied something they very much need because they made a decision earlier on to part with their freedom. And so, when you're terminally ill, and you suddenly discover that you can only have access to FDA-approved treatments for your disease, and you're told by the doctors treating you that there is no drug to treat your condition. And then to survive, you're going to have to find something else. And you discover that your desire and your freedom of choice to attain that end are blocked by the Food and Drug Administration. And so when you need your freedom the most, it's been taken away from you. When you've been in a family that has had a milk farm for 300 years or more, and suddenly federal agents come in and they do a raid on your farm as if you were a drug kingpin engaged in international drug sales, and you're only selling milk. And then you realize your whole life has been turned upside down. Or you are a small businessman who discovers that just to operate a gas station, you have to comply with EPA regulations that will cost you more than it will to run the gas station in profit. Or you find out that you want to have a food establishment, a restaurant, and you discover that federal and state and local regulations affecting your food establishment are so great that you have to have lawyers, and you have to have accountants, and you have to have individuals specially trained to comply, and you have to fill out all these forms, and you have to pay all these fees, and you have to get separate licenses just to be in the business of reselling food others have already manufactured and put in the marketplace. It's the end of liberty.